Hi, welcome to our recorded talk for Wild Things 2021 on Monarch Community Science. My name is Erika Hasle. I'm a conservation ecologist at the Field Museum, and I'm joined by my colleague, Klinger, who's a GIS specialist. And we're going to take you through our project and the results over the last 2 years. We're going to step back and talk about why we study monarch butterflies and the real opportunities and challenges of doing this work in cities. We'll tell you a little bit about the protocol that we used, and then Karen will take you through the results from years 1 and 2 and some of the things we've learned about what can make a successful patch for monarch butterflies. And I'll come back in and talk about what's next over this coming field season. So one thing I love about Wild Things is that it brings people from a huge variety of backgrounds. For some people, this is their first conservation conference, and for some people, this is their 41st. So I'm going to say a little bit about monarchs in general and why people are excited about them. So here in Illinois, in the upper Midwest, we're in a really important place for monarchs. You can see it outlined on this map called the Corn Belt. But this is really a place where monarch populations increase exponentially over the summer. The monarchs that you see late in the season, in late August, early September, are possibly from the super generation, and those monarchs will fly all the way down to where they are now at the Monarch Reserve on the border of Michoacan and state of Mexico in central Mexico. They'll overwinter there, and then in the spring, they'll start generationally moving north until they arrive back in Chicago in June. So it's a really spectacular migration. That's the eastern population of monarchs, east of the Rockies. Those are the ones we have here. There's another population of monarch butterflies west of the Rocky Mountains, conveniently called the western population. And I'll talk a little bit about them because they have different conservation challenges. And monarchs do have conservation challenges. That's another reason that we work on them. This graph is a little confusing because it's measured in hectares, and it's in hectares of butterflies, because that's how the eastern population is measured over the winter. And we're recording this at a really interesting time in February because we could get results from the overwintering population really any day now. And in fact, they may be out by the time you're watching this. And I hope that they're high. But in general, population measurements for the eastern population have been declining over the last 20 years, to the point that monarchs have been put forward to be listed as an endangered species by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who does that. And so that process, they do modeling on the likelihood of the extinction of the species. And for the eastern population that we have, they've calculated that that's a 50 to 70% chance of reaching inevitable extinction in the next 60 years. And for the western population, some of you may have heard that that population now numbers less than 2,000 individuals. And so the chances of extinction within the next 10 years are 60 to 68%. And so for those reasons, the Fish and Wildlife Service found that listing as an endangered species is actually warranted for the monarch butterfly. But then they added these two words, but precluded. And all of us who work in monarchs were like, what does that mean? Because unless you're really steeped in endangered species law, this is not a term that was familiar to many people. And what this means is that the Fish and Wildlife Service, with the resources and the capabilities that they have right now, felt like there are other species that have a bigger, more urgent need, and that's what they needed to put their attention to with the resources that they have at the moment. Now, I think some of us may remember from like wolves when they listed part of the population as endangered and not the whole population. And I think there was some thought that that might happen, that the Western population could get listed as endangered, and the Eastern population, there could be some time to see because there's a lot of conservation work going on. But apparently they can't do that for insects. They can only do that for vertebrate. And they can't be, California has changed their rules so that monarchs can't be listed as state endangered in California. And so this is a big conservation challenge in terms of their legal status, and one that we are probably not going to fix in the near term. The Fish and Wildlife has says they'll revisit the question in 2024. But that doesn't mean that we're not working. That doesn't mean that there's not a lot of work going on to protect the monarch butterfly. And that's really what we're here to talk about, but I felt like it was important to kind of frame why we work on this species. Now, as I said, I want to be sure we get everyone on the same page. So adult monarch butterflies drink nectar from flowers. So what they need to survive and breed and thrive is blooming flowers throughout their growing season and throughout their range. They need flowers in Texas in the spring. They need flowers throughout the growing season here so that they can get fuel. Now, when they breed and lay eggs, female monarchs will only lay eggs on milkweed, and those caterpillars will only eat milkweed plants. So, in order for them to reproduce, sort of their brood habitat, their reproductive habitat is milkweed plants. So, it's important that they have both, and they're probably limited in different ways throughout their life cycle by those two things. But one thing that we know here in the Midwest that milkweed is incredibly important because they are creating multiple generations here. This is where they're really growing the population that's going to make that journey back to Mexico. And of course, many of them will not succeed in that journey. In fact, the US Fish and Wildlife Service has calculated that we need to add 1.6 billion stems of milkweed to stabilize the population. And that number is juxtaposed by a picture of a cornfield because that's probably where a lot of this milkweed was before the advent of Roundup Ready crops, before more intensive agriculture and a better ability to exclude milkweed from the agricultural landscape. And it's not likely that it would return in the same way. Farmers worked hard to exclude milkweed from the landscape, listing it as a noxious weed because it is a problem. When farmers are trying to harvest and they hit a patch of milkweed with a combine and that sticky sap gums up that process, that can be a real problem. And we know Midwest farmers struggle in a lot of ways. And there are solutions that are discussed about planting in strips along the edge of fields, breaking fields up. So the milkweed isn't evenly distributed throughout. It's sort of in a place and they're not going to hit that as part of harvest. And that's an important strategy. So is large landscape conservation. There's nothing like a 10,000 acre prairie. That's incredibly important, and we should preserve those for many reasons, not just for monarch butterflies. But as we look to add 1.6 billion stems of milkweed to the landscape, it's not a one size fits all solution. And that's why we feel like urban landscapes and papers that we have published indicate that urban landscapes are important. They're places that we can add milkweed to the landscape. And when we say urban, we mean cities large and small. We've studied cities large and small. And the potential to add a significant amount of milkweed needed to stabilize the population to the urban landscape east of the Rockies. And I think when I say cities, a lot of us, and sometimes my mind goes to like downtown Chicago, but we mean the entire urban area, wherever you are listening to this talk, because there is a huge area outside of that downtown where people live, where people work, where people shelter in place from COVID-19. And that's what we really studied when we talk about the urban landscape. For the purposes of this, of Chicago, we mean Cook and the surrounding counties, because we use data for those places. But when we looked at other cities, we looked at that larger urbanized area. Really, we're talking about putting a milkweed garden where somebody lives, which could be anywhere. And part of the reason that I and probably many people listening to this talk kind of thought of cities as this concrete jungle, maybe the antithesis of conservation. It's not a place where you find wildlife, is that up until recently, we couldn't really look into the urban landscape with, technology in a very fine-grained way. What you're seeing in the first image A is the best data that I had when I started working at the museum a decade ago, characterizing this area of the loop where the Field Museum is located, and it just looks like a concrete desert. But as technology and computational abilities have gotten better, we can really look into that urban landscape. And you can see in image C, we have picked out all of the non-forested, non-tree green stuff in the South Loop, in a highly urbanized, and it's a little bigger than the South Loop, but in the highly urbanized area of Chicago, and found a lot of these green opportunity areas. Now, of course, some of these are turf grass for a reason, and they will remain turf grass. But as we look at the kind of land use, where when we did this analysis for the entire Cook and Collier County region, we found opportunity, possible milkweed plantable space, exactly where you'd think in open space conservation, like forest preserves, non-conservation, like places that have a recreational mission, like the Park District. Not that they don't do awesome conservation there. And we know that those organizations are working to add pollinator habitat to their landscapes. And at the bottom of the graph, you see rights of way, road utilities, a place where many people have seen milkweed for the first time. And when I described it to them, they're like, oh, the highway plant. And that's a lot more land than any of us really think about. It's long and linear, but it's a huge amount of area. And UIC and actually Karen and my colleague Mark work on that, connecting rights of way utilities, documenting the ways in which conservation happens along there. But the big bar, the really big bar in this graph is residential lands, because there is a huge amount of opportunity in people's yards. Now, there's one thing that's not on this graph, because if it were, it would blow the axis out of proportion, and that's the opportunity in agricultural lands. And it's not on the graph because there are folks working on that. That isn't the focus of what we do right now at the field. So we're going to dive into the opportunities and challenges of that residential landscape. And one of those challenges is that a bunch of different people own it. If you want to stitch together an acre of land to study in the Forest Preserve or the Chicago Park District, it's not that many phone calls. You get a permit and you can do that work. If you want to study an acre of land in people's backyards, you have to make a lot of phone calls, and you might not get 5 people who live next door to each other to say yes. So what you're seeing here is an image from when we were first characterizing how much milkweed there is in the urban landscape, and we had interns drive the public way and basically write down what was in people's yards. Um, and so, like what was flowering? Was it native? Was it non-native? Were there weedy patches? Was there milkweed? And that was really helpful in helping us characterize what was in the urban landscape. But what you see masked in purple is what they couldn't see, because obviously they couldn't get into people's backyards. And stuff like what's held over in orange there are things that they looked at with binoculars from the road, but they couldn't like go and walk through that because that's private land. And obviously that's the challenge of working in residential landscape, is that it's all private land. And the solution, maybe highlighted by the title, is, well, maybe we ask the people that live there. Because even when we got permission to go into people's yards, driving from yard to yard to yard that we had permission from suddenly just became a year of driving. And we were limited by how many places we could drive to in a week because we needed to visit the sites week to week. So we thought, let's ask the people that live there to collect the data for us. And that's one of the ways that we stepped into doing community science. But that puts an emphasis on the second word, the science word. And that first word of community is really important. And we wanted to do a project that had an emphasis on both of them, because there are things to be gained by that. In fact, as people started sending us images of the places where they had milkweed habitat, we saw things like the upper left here that wouldn't have showed up on our GIS remote sensing analysis. A satellite is not going to pick out, an airplane is not going to pick out the opportunity on somebody's balcony. Or this in the upper right, these are probably no more than 1 foot wide native plant gardening between somebody's sidewalk and fence. And we started to see what these things look like. They're located in community gardens, they're located in the medians and the boulevards of roads. And we also started to connect with why people do this work. Because as a lot of us know, it's not just the first step of getting somebody a milkweed plant and getting them to get it in the ground. These things require care. They require continually deciding not to cut it down. They require sometimes replacement, as plants don't last forever. And they require maybe a conversation with your neighbor of why you're growing this thing that they've never seen, why they're growing something that they've thought of as a weed. And so we have to bring people to doing this work in a way that is important and significant to them. And there's the other part, which is that this is a monarch butterfly project because people love monarch butterflies and call and are interested in them. And monarchs are our charismatic microfauna that get us to working on pollinators and bringing bees into people's yards, which sometimes folks aren't as excited about. and doing the work of planting. And our research shows that once people have done one of these conservation actions, they're more likely to do others and perhaps join us all at something like Wild Things. So that led us to our research question. What makes a successful urban monarch garden? And this is really the question that people have asked us. What should I be planting? I've planted milkweed, but I don't see any monarch butterfly eggs. Why is that? Should I plant this or should I plant that? Which milkweed is best? I only have 5 square feet. How can I do the most with that? Or, as some scientists would ask, are all of these urban gardens actually just ecological sinks where monarchs lay eggs that have almost no chance of ever becoming adult monarchs? And that's really what we sought out to answer. So, the protocol that we asked people to do, and this kind of tells you the data that we could collect, is weekly monitoring for the eggs and the life stages of the caterpillar. Monarchs go through 5 stages or instars. When they document an egg, they say which species of milkweed it is on. We get an accurate count of the number of milkweed plants. And once in July at the high season, we measure the area of the garden. Most folks also document for us what flowers are blooming each week, which could be important, obviously, as food for the adult monarch, but in attracting female monarchs to lay eggs. And we don't do this alone. So we didn't want to roll up a community science project that was limited to just the people we could reach. This is part of the National Monarch Larva Monitoring Project, which has been going on since 1997. It's now based out of the University of Wisconsin-Madison Arboretum, run in part by Karen Oberhauser, who's one of the big names in monarch conservation. So we're happy that every year our data goes into their larger database. And so with that, to talk about data, I will turn things over to Karen.
Thank you, Erika. Now I'll present the results from 2 years of our Monarch Community Science Project. Here we see a map of all of our 2020 participant sites. While a majority were located within our primary focus area of the Chicagoland region, we did have a number of participants located in some of the surrounding counties outside of Chicago, as well as in Indiana. When we look closer at Chicago and view our 2019 sites in red and our 2020 sites in yellow, we can see that last year, despite the pandemic and going entirely virtual, we were able to expand the geographic extent of our project area and reach more of Chicago's neighborhoods. Our participants go out every week to monitor the milkweed growing in their garden. As we saw from the photo earlier, these milkweed gardens come in all shapes and sizes, ranging from 1 or more potted plants to along fence lines and large backyards, and even included street medians. Half of the areas surveyed had less than 10 milkweed plants, and the majority were composed of a single milkweed species. The most prevalent milkweed species in people's gardens was common milkweed, followed by swamp milkweed and butterfly milkweed. By virtue of being so easy to grow, common milkweed is a powerhouse, so it is not unexpected that we see it in such quantity. When we look at our 2020 results by milkweed species, we see that with so many common milkweed plants, this was primarily where monarch eggs and caterpillars were seen. While there were about the same number of swamp milkweed and butterfly milkweed plants, swamp milkweed had more than 4 times as many eggs and over 5 times as many first instars as butterfly milkweed. The MLMP regional data, as well as recent research, has also found that while monarchs will lay eggs on various milkweed species, common milkweed and swamp milkweed were more likely to have higher egg totals. Other milkweed species like butterfly milkweed and world milkweed are known to provide good larval food sources, so a variety of milkweed species is important. Other milkweed species planted by our participants included world, prairie, showy, poke, and purple milkweed. In 2019, 73 participants saw over 5,000 eggs and just under 1,500 caterpillars. In 2020, we had more than double the number of participants who saw just over 6,000 eggs and 868 caterpillars. We want to note that we are not comparing these numbers as a measure of population success, since there are different sized populations that are migrating north each year. Instead, we are looking at general trends of when monarchs are being seen as they migrate through the region. In the Midwest, milkweed densities peak around mid-July, so it makes sense that the number of monarch eggs and caterpillars we see here are highest during the month of July, and then begin to decline in late July, early August, as the monarchs continue their migration northward. This move northward was reflected in the MLMP regional garden data for Iowa and Minnesota, which had their higher concentrations in late July and early August. Because our focus is on community-driven data, we cannot say with scientific certainty why so many fewer caterpillars were seen last year. One possibility is that we had higher than average summer temperatures as well as lower than average summer precipitation, which may have impacted the availability of healthy milkweed plants. Other possible contributors may include predation from wasps, ants, spiders, and birds, as well as competition for milkweed from insects like oleander aphids. In order to get an understanding of what makes a successful milkweed garden, we examined some characteristics for sites that had at least 4 weeks of monitoring data. We believe that it is not a single characteristic that makes a successful patch, but is likely a combination of factors. In 2019, we compared sites that had less than 10 eggs to sites that were more successful with either more than 100 eggs or had at least 5 fourth and fifth instars. As we can see from this table, the most successful gardens tended to have more milkweed stems on average, were less likely to be composed of a single milkweed species, had on average more blooming plants, and tended to be larger in size. In 2020, we compared gardens that had no eggs or caterpillars seen with gardens that had 50 or more eggs or where any fourth and fifth instars were found. Last year, we counted milkweed plants instead of stems and found similarly that gardens with more plants on average tended to be more successful. The more successful gardens also were less likely to have a single milkweed species, had on average more species of blooming plants, were more likely to be over a year old, and also tended to be larger in size. In both 2019 and 2020, it looked like milkweed density was less of a factor in determining success. And now I'll turn it back to Erika to talk about some of our lessons learned.
So I said we wanted to have emphasis on both the words community and science and community science. And from community, we really learned about the importance of engagement. This project is both a way for people to engage once they've planted milkweed to see what it's doing for monarchs and to contribute to all of us understanding about that. But also it was a way that we engaged with folks. We had newsletters, we had regular communications. It's important to have a platform that's easy to use. You can't buy a Monarch community science platform. That's not a thing that's for sale. And so Karen built the tool that we used. This is in the first year, it wasn't as easy to use as it was the second year. And people got frustrated when they had to enter repetitive data or complex logins and things like that. We also learned that people pretty much wanted to collect data on paper and pen. We had thought that by having maybe an app that people would take it out in the field and collect data on the app, and almost nobody did that, and we found ourselves not doing that. So that really informs how you then create the platform if somebody has already collected the data and is entering it from a data sheet versus out there in the field collecting with their phone or tablet or whatever. So that was something we learned along the way. And we asked people why they did it, what they enjoyed about it, and they liked having this weekly time scheduled for themselves to spend time in their garden. Being able to share with friends and neighbors what was actually happening by checking every week, you suddenly notice things and you have things to share with people. And they liked that they were contributing to science. Some people said collecting those blooming flowers, they thought that they had something blooming all year, but then once they went to record every week, they noticed, oh, there's this gap. So people enjoyed having that way to enjoy their garden. And that's important because we're asking people to do a hard thing. I think we always say well, native plants are really easy. They're the ones that originally grew here. But native gardening is work, and it's not often, if you learn to garden from a parent or something, it's not what you learned. Many people didn't grow up gardening, and so they're learning to garden with natives, and that's not you can't just go to Home Depot and get whatever you need always for that. So we do need ways to engage people and keep them involved in this process. And it has always been our intention to have this project be bilingual, and it's something that we've worked at. And that is important because it's a growing swath of who the conservation world is. It's welcoming more people into conservation. And lots of folks have a real connection with the monarch butterfly, but it's something that is we have to pay attention to every week and make sure that we're providing all of our communications in that way. We have bilingual Facebook, things like that. Being able to have interpreters for events that we do. So that's important work for growing that community, and it's something we're really focusing on for going forward. And that this is part of building a lasting change. So it's expanding who that conservation audience is. And by getting plants in the ground and sustaining those plants in the ground, we are hopefully sustaining long term change. And we did design this project to be something that families could do together, hopefully. And so the science part, you saw the data and say again that this is a 2-year-old project. We had a pilot year and a pandemic year. We're growing, we're changing, and you're seeing data kind of as it's coming. This isn't like final publishable ready to go data, and that's hard with community science data because it's messy. We don't get to choose all patches that have, you know, 10 milkweeds, 50 milkweeds, or 100 milkweeds. We take the patches that we get and break them as best that we can. We don't all have the same milkweed density. We don't all have the same species composition. They're not, all located in the same part of the city or along a random transect line or something. We take the data that we can get because that's how community science works, and we make of it what we can. And so consistency can be hard. We need people to check every week and ideally like exactly 7 days. But that's hard to get. That's hard to ask people to do that because the caterpillars move through their stages. If you go too long without looking, then suddenly we can't use that data because we don't know if anything happened to that egg. So that's a challenge. Is getting people to record data if they're not seeing eggs or caterpillars. But that's really important, understanding the traits of those gardens, and we hear about them. Sometimes people submit them or they call us because they're frustrated that they've planted milkweed and they haven't seen eggs, or they're only seeing a handful of eggs and there's nothing really happening to the caterpillars. And so understanding what's happening in those gardens is really important, but getting people to continually be excited to record zero for you every week is hard. So what's next? Hopefully we've convinced you to maybe do the project or be interested in thinking about doing the project, which is really all you're doing if you sign up at bit.ly/monarch monitors. That gets you an email from us when it's time to start thinking about signing up for a training, getting fully registered. We know that we'll be having trainings in English on May 12th, May 15th, and May 27th. We will be scheduling more. We'll be scheduling our Spanish language trainings, but that's going to take a few more weeks. If you sign up at bits.ly/monarch, we'll let you know about the trainings in both languages. For folks who sign up and come to a training, we typically do a milkweed giveaway, so you can come get a plant, often also a nectaring plant. We'll be getting those on the calendar. We know we will be having one at Beaubien Woods on June 12th as part of Beaubien Community Day. We will make sure we have them distributed throughout the Chicago region, but that's the one we know that's happening. And obviously, if you sign up, we will let you know more. And, this project is a lot. It's a big commitment. And if you're thinking, boy, weekly data collection throughout the summer, I'm probably not going to do that. I'm looking for something I can do once or a handful of times. Chicago Botanic Gardens Community Science Program Budburst might be a good choice for you. They are doing both phenology projects on when flowers bloom, when leaves change colors. So then you're taking just at those specific times data, but they're also doing a milkweed and monarch project focused on smaller numbers of plants. If you have only a handful of plants, and we're sharing data with them. So if you feel like I only have a handful of plants, I don't know if I want to commit every week, that could be a really great opportunity. We think this is also a great fit maybe for schools, depending on what's happening with schools this summer. But have found a lot of teachers have told us that committing to our full project is a lot for a school and a classroom. So Budburst would be a great thing to check out, and we'll still be able to use your data and they'll still be able to share it in our data. And if you want to learn more, The national organization working for monarchs, both east and west of the Rockies, is Monarch Joint Venture. Highly recommend checking out their site. They have a lot of good resources. If you are maybe a teacher or doing presentations and looking for resources, they have a lot of good stuff, often bilingual. And if you're like, hey, I want some of that milkweed, check out Illinois Native Plant Society. They have a great listing of native plant sales and native plant nurseries throughout Illinois. If you're not in Illinois, there's probably a native plant society for your state. So with that, thank you. And thank you for our Monarch. Have a good day.